Starting tonight with Assemblyman Mike Gianaris, who is actually no stranger to Capitol Tonight regulars. Assemblyman, I should say Senator-elect, nice to see you.
Thank you, Liz. Good to be with you again.
So most people know you because you were here for our redistricting series, and then you gave us a little bit of an update on that. But in fact, you ran for the Senate, and you are deeply involved in the recount effort now. In fact, you're going to be headed back to Buffalo.
Yeah, that's right. I was in Buffalo last week as we began setting the schedule for that effort for Senator Antoine Thompson, and I'll be heading back tomorrow morning to continue. And we're optimistic that things are going to work out for us.
What exactly is going on at this point? There were as many as 9 lawyers. We had Bob McCarthy from the Buffalo News telling us about that on Friday. What's actually going on there at this point, and how long do you think it could last?
Well, we're still at the point where we're inventorying the various forms of paper ballots that are out there, and at this point it looks like there's over 5,000 additional votes to be counted between absentee ballots, affidavit ballots, and emergency ballots. And we're still at the point where the board is kind of opening their lock boxes and taking stock of how many of those there are. I think this is it's a deliberate process, as it should be. We want to make sure that we respect everyone's franchise and their right to vote, and so we're going to do this very carefully and deliberately to make sure that no senior citizen or other voter in Western New York is denied their important right to vote. And so we're going to take our time. Everyone needs to take a breath and not expect that we're going to see any results in the next couple of days, that's for sure, but it will take several weeks, I think, at a minimum before we get to a conclusion.
Will you be calling for a full recount? Because there are people across the state, candidates who are in tight races, who have brought into question the new voting machines and also said perhaps now that we have all this paper, we should make use of it by recounting everything by hand, which wouldn't just take weeks but actually months.
Yeah, well, it's a real interesting question, and part of the reason things are going to take maybe a little longer this time than normal is because of the fact that this is the first time these new machines have been in use throughout the state as they have been. In many ways, we have to be extra careful because the standards that are set in these recounts are going to be the standards that exist going off into the future. So the courts are going to have to weigh in on when a full recount is done and when it is not appropriate to do so. And we're going to go through this process in a very careful way, but the most important thing to us as these decisions get made over the next several days and weeks is that everyone's right to vote must be respected. We want to make sure the intent of every voter is honored, and that's what's going to be driving us as we move through the process. How long it's going to take is a little bit unclear because it depends on what standards the court set first as to when a recount will be permitted or not. But I think for everyone involved, the important thing is votes need to be counted. The reason we have these machines in the first place is because of the reaction to the Bush versus Gore fiasco in the year 2000, and the system was set up to require paper ballots exactly for the reason that we have the ability now to go back and make sure they were counted right.
Well, but now you're talking about an enormous cost. I mean, a recount could just cost an enormous amount of money. Already there are appeals being sent out by the Senate Democrats. How far in debt are the Senate Democrats at this point?
Well, we're going to have to wait till the filing to publicly disclose that. I don't have that information at my fingertips right now, but the fact is, obviously, a lot of money was spent on the campaigns on both sides. And in any event, we're confident that whatever is necessary to get through this next process, we're going to raise, and we're going to have a fully funded effort in the various districts, not only in the Buffalo and Niagara area, but also in Nassau County and in Westchester, to make sure that no matter how much it costs, no matter what kind of effort is needed, we're going to have full teams in place in each of these locations to make sure that the votes are respected and people's votes are counted.
I know that you were a candidate during the campaign, but you actually had minimal opposition, and you were unusually involved. You traveled all over the state. You raised money for some of your soon-to-be colleagues or the people you hoped would be your colleagues. Did you get a sense that Antoine Thompson was in trouble? Because a lot of people told me that this came sort of out of left field, and it's unclear as to why he was endangered and not sufficiently, as it turns out, assisted.
Well, this was a year where everyone was in trouble. We took nothing for granted, obviously, especially in Western New York, where Carl Palladino had a disproportionate influence because that's the part of the state that he is from and is most well known. It was clear that this was a volatile year, not only in New York, but throughout the country. and that everyone was at risk. To be honest with you, I made sure that I ran a campaign in my race as well, and it did turn out well for me. But we took nothing for granted throughout this state. I don't, that's one of the reasons why we actually achieved some important victories with our challengers, Tony Avella, who beat a 38-year incumbent in Queens, or David Carlucci, who won a seat in Rockland, and Tim Kennedy, who held on in the neighboring district in Buffalo.
If I could just interrupt for 1 second, the Tim Kennedy race actually is a perfect example. I mean, Tim Kennedy actually won quite handily, and if in fact the Carl Palladino factor was an issue, then why was it not similarly, why didn't Antoine manage to rise above the tide? I mean, it didn't hurt Tim Kennedy, the Palladino factor.
Every campaign would rise and fall in unique circumstances, particular to those elections. But I think the efforts put forward on behalf of all our candidates was the maximum effort. That's why we ended up achieving such important victories in some of the other districts, and in other districts we fared less well. But in the end, we're confident that after we go through this process, after the votes are counted, Senator Thompson's going to be victorious, as will Senator Oppenheimer and Senator Johnson. Will maintain the majority on the Democratic side. Okay, in some cases, there are Democrats who say that the best that you could hope for at this point is 31-31. And to suggest that the best that you can hope for is a tie, sort of reminiscent of what happened last summer, is a little bit scary. But in this case, you actually have a lieutenant governor who can, in some cases, break a tie, but that is up for discussion at this point. What is your understanding of the power of Lieutenant Governor-elect Bob Duffy? Well, let me first say, I don't know who you're talking to, but if anyone looks at what happened out in Suffolk County with Congressman Bishop's election over the last couple of days, none of these elections are in the bag. No one can tell you what's going to happen in them. Well, wait. Hold on. If that's the case, then I don't know what to call you, Senator or Assemblyman, Senator-elect. If that's the case, then why not just recount everything? If that's the case. Well, it may well be that we come to that point. That's a decision for the courts to make, and whether one part or the other requests it remains to be seen. But that is something that's going to be considered and discussed over the coming weeks. We're not there yet. We're still at a point where we're setting schedules with the boards of elections. We're taking inventory of what's out there and what's not, and there will come an appropriate time for that decision to be made. One thing that we know for sure, it's the standard we've laid out in all these elections, is that every vote will be counted, and every vote will be counted in a way that honors the intent of the voter. Okay, so if in fact you did call for, and when I say everything, I mean the whole shebang. If you did that, who would come to Albany on January 1st or 2nd or 3rd, whenever the session starts? I mean, who would be elected if you recount every single race in the state? Oh, you asked if we should recount all 62 districts in the state? Yeah. I don't think anyone's talking about that. There are a number of elections that were not competitive, and therefore the winners we can expect will be certified, where no one's challenging the results coming from the board. You'd need one party or the other to actually file a challenge and file a court action to allow a lot of these things to go forward. So we're really down to just those 3 remaining districts in the state Senate. Where we're pushing ahead, and based on the paper that's out there and what we do know at this early stage is where these various additional votes are located, we're pretty confident that in all 3 that the Democratic candidates will be gaining votes in all 3 cases. So that's why I could say we're confident we're going to hold the majority by the time this is over. Well, you bring up, though, the congressional race in the 1st congressional district, which is out on Long Island. That's the Randy Altshuler, Congressman Tim Bishop race. Do you have faith in these machines, and do you think voters should have faith in these machines if a race like that one can flip so dramatically? I mean, it looked like Tim Bishop had won, then they recanvassed the machines, and it seemed actually no. It turns out he's down by several thousand votes. Why should any voter believe that any of these races were actually effectively conducted? Well, that's what we're going to find out, and I think the particular problem out on Long Island was that it was a recording error. In other words, the poll workers who were reporting the results unofficially on election night made some mistakes in how they were communicating those numbers, and so when they actually looked at the machines, the numbers were in fact corrected. But one of the important things to remember, and that's why I hope people will have patience with the process, is there's a requirement that the votes were cast on a piece of paper as opposed to a paperless electronic system, exactly so we can make sure that we have a process to make sure that people's votes are counted the way they were intended, and we're not relying on a machine that may or may not be making mistakes. Back to the 31-31 question, if you will. Do you have some feeling at this point what the Lieutenant Governor-elect's responsibility and power would be? Would he be able, for example, to cast just procedural votes, which means that he could select a leader, or would he be able to actually break ties on legislation? Because the Republicans and the Democrats seem to have a different point of view, and even the Governor-elect has a point of view on this. Yeah. Well, as you well know, Liz, I did a fair amount of research on the powers of a lieutenant governor and a lieutenant governor's selection last year when we were grappling with the possibility of the appointment, which turned out to be upheld in court. I think in many cases this is something that's going to end up in the court without a doubt. Most people seem to believe, as I do, that the lieutenant governor has the ability to break ties for quote-unquote procedural type issues such as the selection of a leader. It's a little bit more of an open question when you talk about whether on substantive issues and legislation the lieutenant governor has that power. If it comes to that, and it may not, but if it comes to that, I think that that's something that ultimately will be decided by the highest court in the land.
Okay, so what you're saying to me is that the one thing that New Yorkers can count on is a lot of lawsuits in the next couple of months?
Well, we're already in court in the three contested Senate races that are still outstanding. If, in fact, we end up at 31-31, I would expect there would be some issues of interpretation that a court would have to handle as to the powers of a lieutenant governor. But that's what the courts are there for.
Well, it is certainly a historic election for perhaps not the reasons that people thought that it would be. I want to thank you very much, Senator-elect Mike Gianaris, for joining us. We'll be catching up with you again.
Thank you, Liz.